Jack, take it away for Knoxville and the presidency.
I appreciate y'all joining us. We're all distracted by the news this week, and I knew that we couldn't probably think about anything but the presidency. So that's our subject this week. And the subject is Knoxville and the presidency. And we're going to be talking about presidential visits to the city. And then at the end, we're going to be talking about some Knoxvillians who made a run for the presidency to various degrees. We're going to be talking about something that I think a lot of people would consider trivia. What presidents visited Knoxville when, what happened. You could say it's superficial to think of history that way, but it is. Presidential visits are an indication of a city's importance, I think, to some degree. And in a campaign season, presidential visits also suggest that a state's unpredictability, of what we now call battleground states or swing states. That those are both fairly new terms, but Tennessee, we almost forget these days. Tennessee was a swing state for about 150 years, and it was a place that there was a lot of fierce campaigning done because you never knew every 4 years whether Tennessee was going to go Democrat or Republican. But anyway, this is we're going to be going through several presidential visits. I want to mention a few distinctions Knoxville has that make it unusual among American cities. One was that it was founded by a presidential administration. Knoxville was founded by George Washington's administration, and it was to be the capital of this new federal territory, the Southwestern Territory. And it was named for a member of his presidential cabinet, and that was Henry Knox, the Secretary of War. However, George Washington didn't visit Knoxville. He made a kind of a famous trip up and down the East Coast at one point in his career. But most presidents didn't visit. Most presidents never visited most of the states that they governed in those days. The early founding fathers didn't budge much from Virginia or Pennsylvania or New York unless they were going to Paris or somewhere to be ambassador, which is what Thomas Jefferson did. Thomas Jefferson's got an unusual place in history in a way, in that he was from Northern Virginia, and he's considered the Southern president to many people, but he never left Northern Virginia to the South. He never saw any of the South except for Virginia, as far as I know. He actually purchased Louisiana, but never went there, never set foot in New Orleans, for example. Anyway, people didn't travel as a matter of course a lot as presidents. They didn't think it was their business to go to every single state and look around. By the way, Jefferson, did have a little connection to Knoxville in that he wrote a letter in response to a rather arrogant entreaty that he helped UT, or as it was called then, East Tennessee College, with a kind of what's the term? Kind of a gambling, kind of a raffle sort of a project to help raise money for this college. And he wrote back that he thought it was a bad idea, but he gave them some free advice about how to set up their college, to have different buildings for different departments, which is what UT eventually did, whether it was because Jefferson's letter had anything to do with it or not. But that's a little connection that Thomas Jefferson had to Knoxville in a city in a state that he never visited in his life. But that was the way it was. So we didn't get many presidential visits during this early period, really until the post-Civil War era, 1870s and later, when railroad travel became fast, comfortable, and safe. And that's when presidents started getting around the country and seeing the country they governed much more than they had been before. You may have heard that there's a project going on. In fact, I first heard about 20 years ago, a presidential museum in Knoxville. And some people think it's an outlandish idea. Why should Knoxville, of all places, have a presidential museum? And I once took this on as I'm not involved, by the way, at all. I haven't met the people who are leading this project to whatever the extent they're leading it. But I haven't, I don't know exactly where it is now or whatever, but I have took this on some years ago in a column, kind of in a devil's advocate sort of way. What does Knoxville have to do with the presidency? And I thought, well, there are two reasons Knoxville might have more than its quota of presidential visits and more to do with the presidency than your average city of this size. One is, as I mentioned earlier, it was in a swing state from the Civil War until 2000. Tennessee was unpredictable, and people did campaign here a lot, both sides. We usually saw both candidates here in Knoxville for many years and during the elections. But also, during this era when travel was not as common as it became later, Tennessee presidents, there were several presidents from Tennessee who were very familiar with Knoxville. In fact, I think 3 of our first 17 presidents, mostly during this era of less travel, were Tennesseans, and all of them were familiar with this place we know pretty well too. Um, but there were not any known presidents to visit here before 1877 as president, as part of the presidency. But we'll talk about that one in a little bit. But I also want to mention, just as a footnote, there's one other president who did know Knoxville pretty well, who was not a U.S. president. His name was Sam Houston. He was president of the Lone Star Republic. And he was a guy that came to Knoxville to give a talk every now and then. Very popular guy here. In fact, he spent a lot of his childhood in the Maryville area. So he was another familiar figure around here. But to begin with, most of all, I think of all the early presidents who spent time in Knoxville, no one spent more time here than our first slide, and that's Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson never lived here, of course. He lived in Middle Tennessee at the Hermitage. Many of you have been to the Hermitage, I'm sure. I've been there a couple times. Never lived here. He repeatedly visited, beginning in 1796, or at least by then, probably before that. 1796 was when he was one of the 55 delegates that there were that came together and formed the Constitution of Tennessee, that formed the state of Tennessee. He was one of the youngest members. He was only in his 20s at the time. But he was here at that time. But also when the state was founded, we had a lot of the main courts. The Supreme Court was here in Knoxville, and Jackson was a justice on that court, and he was here frequently for that purpose, and was also involved in a circuit court sort of thing that had him in and out of town. He had an unusual career in that he was a judge as a young man. 20 years before, he was a military hero. He had just a really unusual resume in that regard. But after he was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, and fighting the British at the end of the War of 1812, there was a big reception for him at the Lamar House in downtown Knoxville. That I think was the very first big reception, big event of any kind that was at the Lamar House, which we're glad to say is still there. It's the front of the Bijou Theater. That was the building that they had the reception for Jackson at. He never had an official presidential visit, but to Knoxville. They didn't really do that much in those days, but he often stayed here on his journeys to and from between the White House and the Hermitage. It took him right through Knoxville, and he, as I understand it, sometimes stayed in downtown Knoxville, and at least once stayed at Campbell Station at the tavern there. We know about this. There's a very vivid description of him by a British geologist named George Featherstone Hall, or Fanshawe, as I'm told it's sometimes pronounced. But just happened to walk in, and there was Jackson sitting by himself, drinking a cup of coffee or something in the meeting room of the tavern, and he was just astonished to see one of the most famous Americans in the world sitting by himself in a tavern on the Kingston Road, and he sat down and had a few words with him. Anyway, there's another story that we have in the Bearden book about Jackson, that he came into Knoxville during one of these trips to and from town. And a lot of us would worry if we were riding a horse down a road and saw a bunch of guys with big sticks in front of us. And Jackson may have worried too, but it turned out they were all fans, and the big sticks were hickory sticks, and they were symbolizing the old hickory, his famous nickname. But anyway, he was entertained in Bearden, I think at the Lions House, but had some connections there. But by the way, there are a lot of things named for Jackson throughout the South: Jackson, Mississippi, Jackson, Tennessee. But Jackson Avenue is not named for Jackson. A lot of people assume that it is. It's named for a railroad executive named Richard Jackson, who was here prominent in the years after the Civil War. Anyway, there is, I think, his most significant legacy in Knoxville is the Jackson Papers Project. All the Andrew Jackson's papers, all of his letters and letters to him and about him are being assembled laboriously, and they've been working on this for many years and have many years to come. I think they're up to the year 1834 or 1835 now. But the Jackson Papers is a big deal. This is going to be the national repository. If you want to know anything about Jackson and his administration, very dramatic times, you'll go to UT and look at the Jackson Papers. The same is true for our next president, James K. Polk, who is also from Middle Tennessee. Spent less time in Knoxville proper, but he was here a few times. The Polk Papers are also at the University of Tennessee. And I think that project is already completed. He didn't have quite as many papers as Jackson did from his very, very long career. But the next one is the other Tennessee president, Andrew Johnson. He probably didn't spend as much time here as Jackson did, even though he was an East Tennessean. He was from Greenville, of course. And as Paul and I know, we got to explore his hometown last year when Paul had his swearing-in ceremony as a U.S. citizen in Greenville. But it's a well-kept museum, very interesting museum to look at. It has his tailor shop enclosed inside a museum. But he was the Taylor president. He was an interesting, and whatever else we say about him, he was a brave guy. He was a hardcore Unionist. Had nothing to do with the Confederacy. Early in the war, he was giving anti-Confederacy speeches in 1861, just as Knoxville was half full of Confederates. And in one of these speeches on Gay Street, he was actually shot at once. But he became governor of Tennessee during the Civil War after a Union occupation. I've always said that if he had been assassinated, he became, ironically, or surprisingly, a Republican. He was a Democrat who became a Republican president's vice president in Lincoln's second term. He was chosen to be his running mate. Lincoln wanted to reach out and get a Southern Democrat on his side. And he picked Johnson. Some people think it was a mistake, but Johnson was the vice president when Lincoln was assassinated. And John Wilkes Booth's his plan was to kill Johnson too the same night, and that plan went awry. Johnson survived, but I've always thought if he had been assassinated on April 15th, 1865, he'd be remembered as a great American hero. He'd be this bold Unionist who would not brook what he considered treason during the Civil War, and help keep the country together by representing his district as representing his state in the U.S. Senate and in Washington before that. But he had friends in Knoxville, including the John Williams family. If you go to the Riverside Drive and see the old Williams house, the Williams Jr. There are two John Williams houses on the east side of downtown. That was a house that he stayed in sometimes, where John Williams the Younger lived. But I need to mention the largest building in the world named for Andrew Johnson is on Gay Street, as you probably know, the Andrew Johnson Hotel, which is now known as the Andrew Johnson Building. It's been an office building since the 1970s, but it was built in the late 1920s as a hotel. Was originally called the Tennessee Terrace. And if not for a book, an unusual revisionist history book that came out in the late 20s that painted Johnson as kind of a homespun hero, it would probably still be called the Tennessee Terrace. But they thought, gosh, it looks like in the future people are going to think of Andrew Johnson as a great hero. Let's name this hotel for him, and they did, and it's had that name ever since. for better or worse. Um, but the over the years, there are several people who became president who had been here before. Ulysses S. Grant, for example, was president for 8 years, uh, but uh, but had never came here as president, but had been here during the war. He'd been here for about a week or two during the Civil War, right at the end of 1863 and or beginning of 1864, the beginning of this year that Grant became really famous. He was already pretty well known, but he had a lot of his greatest triumphs in 1864. He began that year here in Knoxville, and I think he was staying with Burnside on Gay Street. Um, but the first president who came here as part of his office as president was Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877, who came here to give a speech. Hayes was a guy who was elected after one of the more controversial elections in U.S. history. 1876 was something I think we would be would seem like to us like reverse deja vu if we're going to go back in history. It was one of the very few elections of history before the 21st century, at least, that a guy who got a fewer of the popular votes than his opponent did became president. And the way that happened, Rutherford B. Hayes had a one delegate majority in the Electoral College. He had fewer popular votes than Tilden did, the Democrat. Rutherford B. Hayes was a Republican. Hayes became elected president with fewer popular votes, but had one more Electoral College vote than Tilden did, and became president only after a big discussion in Congress in which he agreed to make a concession to the Democrats, and that was to end military reconstruction in the South. And whether that was a good idea or not in 1877, the year that he was inaugurated, is up to historians to discuss. But Hayes was elected in 1877, was inaugurated in 1877, and made a tour of the South, kind of to help bind wounds, I think, but also to make friends with the Democrats who had been angry about some of the civil rights legislation and so forth. So we can see it as kind of an unholy alliance in a way his presidency was between the Republicans who had been the Civil Rights Party and the former Confederates, many of whom were holding out for keeping the vote away from Black people, although they are by this time Black people already had the vote in the Constitution, so it really didn't make that much difference. But the end of Reconstruction meant kind of the beginning of other kind of ugly things that happened. Anyway, he came here and gave a talk on the balcony of the Lamar House on Gay Street, and tried to make friends with former Confederates. He probably didn't have to do so much of that here because Knoxville was more of a Unionist place anyway, much more of a Republican place already. So I don't know if he was surprised at this when he got here, that this place had been Republican since the Civil War. But he gave a talk, and a well-attended talk. That talk, by the way, for many years and in many respected books, and I think we look at the next image, Paul. This image here was identified as Rutherford B. Hayes's speech in 1877 in front of the Lamar House. Again, this is the building. It doesn't have the gable on top anymore, but it's the same building that's the front of the Bijou Theater. But some people studied this photograph and realized it was actually a slightly older photograph of a presentation of a banner to the McClung Guards, which was. But that was, there are several people in the audience there. It was probably a bigger crowd for Hayes, I'm guessing. But anyway, but Hayes was on that same little balcony above the front door of the Lamar House when he gave his speech. He was here, I think, just for the day. Arrived on the train. Again, presidents are arriving on the train. After Hayes, I don't know whether Garfield or Arthur ever came here. Grover Cleveland came here once, and he was a Democrat, of course, the famous for his non-consecutive terms in office, the only president who has been reelected after losing an election. But a lot of his Democratic friends came out to meet him at 4 a.m. at the train station, thinking he would come out and at least wave to him. But as someone noted in the newspaper at the time, he slept through his only visit to Knoxville. But anyway, Benjamin Harrison, the Republican, was here as part of and gave here a whistle-stop speech in 1891, and also came into town a little bit to do something that a lot of Republican presidents have done. It began a tradition, I think, and let's look at the next slide, Paul. Kind of a surprising little ritual that at least four Republican presidents made a visit to this house on the right. It was kind of just a simple frame house, kind of run down probably by the late 1800s, to visit one very old lady who was Mrs. Parson Brownlow, the widow of Parson Brownlow, who was a Republican hero, not just in Tennessee, but nationally. Parson Brownlow was arguably the first Republican in Tennessee, if not in the South, because he switched from being a Whig to being a very fiercely hardcore and even radical Republican by the end of the Civil War. He was our governor of the state of Tennessee, and the kind of the bold moves that he made to support the Republican Party nationally and its agenda, especially with the constitutional amendments, the 13th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution, was made him legendary. And several presidents of the United States, Republican presidents, all of them, beginning with Harrison, but going through William McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, and William Howard Taft, all made kind of obligatory visits to this house, to see the house where Parson Brownlow and his wife lived during Confederate occupation, where they kept running up the U.S. flag even during Confederate occupation, and braved this. He kept publishing his anti-Confederate paper for a few months at least, until they finally jailed him. But this was a shrine to Republicans for many years. Ironically, it was almost completely forgotten at the time that it was torn down in the 1920s after the death of Eliza Brownlow. Anyway, this was there were it's interesting to remember this. Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, he was one of the most popular and frequent visitors to Knoxville. We don't have any good pictures of him, but he came here several times during and after his presidency. He gave a big talk in the downtown auditorium one time, and I think, knowing his audience, he turned and remarked about that he could see John Severe's grave, which we can see in the courthouse lawn today, the giant obelisk that's over the bones of the moved remains of John Severe, who was originally buried in Alabama. But he had stories about John Severe. He said he grew up hearing about John Severe. John Severe was a hero in history books when Teddy Roosevelt was growing up, and he had some stories to tell about him. He mentions them in some of his books. But anyway, that was one time. Another time he came back for the of course, Roosevelt was a conservationist. He came back for the Appalachian Expositions, which had kind of a conservation theme. He was here, I believe, in 1910, just after his presidency, and gave a speech at Chilhowie Park, and that was something that people paid a lot of attention to. It was during that time in 1910, and I ran across this story. I never heard this story until I researched the Tennessee Theater book, and I saw an interview with Tom Mix, the cowboy hero. Believe it or not, Tom Mix claimed that he and Teddy Roosevelt were mutual admirers. Tom Mix, who was a movie cowboy, the guy with a giant hat, he was in silent films, and he was a real to some extent a real cowboy, a guy that knew what he was doing. But he and Roosevelt were mutual admirers, and they met each other in Knoxville. And he said they went out and did the town, and they shot pool and did all sorts of stuff together downtown during their stay together. But Knoxville was newly dry then. I don't think that either one of them drank much, but that was that's a surprising image to picture Tom Mix and Teddy Roosevelt, kind of painting the town red in 1910. Um, right after Roosevelt was the next president, we have a lot of pictures of this guy in Knoxville, even though I think he was just here once. William Howard Taft was here in 1911. Kind of a grand visit. It was during another exposition, the second Appalachian Exposition. Teddy Roosevelt had been here for the first. Taft was here for the second, but he was president at the time, and this was a presidential visit. He stayed at the Atkin House Hotel downtown, and it was there that he gave a big dinner speech. He was here for a couple of meals, and as you know, William Howard Taft liked his was fond of his meals, so he probably didn't complain. But Taft was he was sorry. There's a story. I knew there was a story I was trying to remember. I met an elderly lady who lived in Sequoia Hills about 20 years ago, and she had a vivid memory of when she and her sister, and she couldn't remember sure which president it was, but she said she and her sister were at the Atkin Hotel and remembered going into a famous person's room and finding these enormous pants hanging over a chair in that room. And they said they were so big that she and her sister could stand in either leg of the pants and zip it up over their heads. And I said, could that have been William Howard Taft? And she said, that's the one. That's the one that we got to see him. I don't know why he changed pants. I guess he had a couple of pairs of pants when he was here, but he gave a big talk at the big banquet hall at the Atkin Hotel. And the guy that introduced him was kind of his military advisor, and his name was Major Archibald Butt. And that I wouldn't mention that except for the fact that this is the Archibald Butt, you've probably heard his name before, who 5 months later got on a very big ocean liner called the Titanic, probably against I guess his better options, but he was lost, was never found again when the Titanic sank. But that was the guy that introduced Taft during his time in town. Here's a picture of Taft at the Southern Station. If you can see, he's the guy with the kind of the Homburg style hat, if that's what that is. Yeah, Paul's pointing to it there, and you can see the walkway that we still see, the walkway from the Southern Station going over to Depot Street. That's still there today. And again, the Atkin Hotel was the hotel right across the street from this. So that's all within a short little distance. And there's a African American man driving his car, either probably to Challoway Park from there, where he gave an address there as well. All right. And here's some other pictures of Taft in Knoxville. We're not sure what building that is. I don't know whether it was part of the. It looks like maybe a storage or even a stable building. I can't tell for sure what that is. But all right. Okay, it was. There were a few other visitors back on the train station area. That there are a lot of presidents just made time for a whistle stop. Woodrow Wilson came by there one time and gave a brief talk. And along with his companion, it was his son-in-law, William Gibbs McAdoo, who was also his Secretary of the Treasury, who was a guy from Knoxville. We'll be talking about him a bit later. I'm not sure whether a bunch of Republicans afterwards came to Knoxville during the presidency. I've never found a Harding. I understand that Harding came here before his presidency. Coolidge, I don't know that he ever came here. Hoover. Even though Hoover made a car trip through East Tennessee, I don't think he came to Knoxville proper. But here's a great picture of Franklin Roosevelt in Knoxville, and I believe this is this from the 1936 parade. I'm not sure. He was here twice for two parades in 1936, 1940. I think he was here at least one other time as well. But FDR, of course, was very prominent in Knoxville history because we wouldn't have something called the Tennessee Valley Authority if not for Franklin Roosevelt. It was part of one of the last remaining parts of his New Deal, along with Social Security and a couple other things. But the Tennessee Valley Authority some people come here and are surprised to see it, come here from other parts of the country. They've read about it in their history books. They think it was a 1930s thing and didn't realize that it's still the main power producer for everybody from Virginia to Mississippi. But Franklin Roosevelt and his administration founded TVA and came down to check on it now and then. But they also came here for another thing that they were somewhat involved with, at least, and that was the dedication of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This was not a Roosevelt initiative. It was actually open as a park before his administration, but it had its formal opening in the second year of his presidency, and had this official dedication several years later in 1940. And a lot of you will recognize this as Newfound Gap. That really hasn't changed. That view has not changed very much. But he has a very characteristic smile. I wish I knew the joke he just told, but that's a great picture of Franklin Roosevelt in the Smokies. There are, I'm not sure, I've been told that Truman was here. I've never found an account of that visit. It'd be weird if he wasn't, because he was from Missouri, the next state over, and had reasons to come here. In fact, Tennessee supported Truman in 1948. But Eisenhower was here once. Don't have good pictures of him. He was here during his term. And John Kennedy was here a couple of times. He was here before his presidency in 1959, when he made a big grand visit to Oak Ridge National Laboratory. He landed at the Knoxville airport and went out that way, spent the day, and gave a talk out in Oak Ridge. Was very interested in what they were doing there. Naturally, as it was during the Cold War, and Oak Ridge represented our defense against the Soviet Union. And speaking of the Soviet Union, it's interesting to remember that another visitor to Oak Ridge, about 4 years later, after Kennedy's visit there, was a young man completely unknown to the world at the time, named Lee Harvey Oswald, who signed a guest register at Oak Ridge in the summer of 1963, and wrote his name and wrote USSR as if he was representing the Soviet Union in his visit to Oak Ridge. But a troubled young man who unfortunately would intersect, his life would intersect with President Kennedy's just a few months later. All right. Next, after Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson came here. Actually, the first president I've ever seen, my grandfather, who was a Republican. I wonder how often this happens, that a Republican grandfather takes his grandson to see a Democratic president. But my grandfather took me down to see President Johnson in the big motorcade down Cumberland Avenue in 1964. He was here talking about his war on poverty. He stopped kind of unexpectedly in front of UT and got out and said a few words to some students gathered there, and then went on to give a speech downtown. Later on, President Nixon was here a couple times, both when he was running for office in 1968, when he gave a big speech at the Civic Coliseum downtown. And then in 1970, and this is him at UT talking to the Pride of Southland marching band, probably in the 1970 visit when he was president. This was a significant visit for him. It wasn't just a random sort of a thing. Nixon was here. Nixon was really beleaguered in 1970. The Vietnam War was not going well. Things were going really terrible. There were riots at home. The Cambodia bombing had been just a few weeks earlier. This was and the Kent State shootings had happened a few weeks earlier. He had been kind of holed up in the White House, and people were saying, when is Nixon ever going to come out of the White House? He's kind of staying away from everybody. It's like he just wants the whole world to cool off before it's safe to come out again. Well, he thought it would be safe to come out again to a Republican state, to a public university in a Republican state in the South. What's safer than that in 1970? And he had a bit of a surprise because there were quite a lot of demonstrators. He came here actually to a Billy Graham crusade at Neyland Stadium, which many people thought was inappropriate to come to a religious thing to make a political stand. But he came out here. He and Billy Graham were friends. Billy Graham was friends with Republican and Democratic presidents over the years. But he came out and gave a speech, and there were hundreds and hundreds of students in the northeast part of the stadium, shouting at Nixon as he spoke, and it was many of them were arrested. I think there were more than 100 of them arrested that day. This is one of them. This is a guy named Carroll Bible. This is, I guess, the most iconic picture of the Neyland Stadium unrest. Again, this whole area had both students and faculty, many of them in the stands, just demonstrating during Nixon's speech. And this guy, I'm glad I got to know him some years later. We actually got to be did a lot of beer drinking together about 20 years ago. But interesting guy. He was later a teacher. He later worked as a nurse and other things. But he's just this iconic image. A lot of people didn't know who he was, but his name is Carroll Bible. But anyway, that was one of the more dramatic events. One of the more dramatic. I think they say that there was no more activist public university in the South than the University of Tennessee. And this was, I think, the climax of several months of demonstrations that had included some violent things, firebombing the ROTC, taking over campus. They actually took, during the student strike, they actually took over parts of campus, including the student center. But a very interesting period in Knoxville's history and UT's. All right. Next, things had settled down somewhat when I think one of our most laid-back presidents, Gerald Ford, came here in 1975, and this was one of the biggest presidential visits in terms of policy in Knoxville history, at least. I don't know how much it stands up in American history, but it was a White House conference on Mid-Appalachia, and he talked about. Imagine this: a president coming out and talking in public and answering questions from the public about energy policy for hours and hours. And this is what he did: energy policy and education and other issues that he dealt with at the old Hyatt Regency, of course, which is different from the current Hyatt hotel. This is the modernist Hyatt Regency that had been built just a few years earlier on the east side of downtown. But this was a big thing with several of his advisors were here. The whole White House press corps, a lot of the national press was here covering this all-day conference that he held in a big room with a lot of invited guests. I think there were a couple of hundred people there in all. But it was one of the bigger presidential moments in Knoxville history. Later on, we had a World's Fair. It was actually people began talking about the same time as this conference, and this was a big deal. President Jimmy Carter, who helped a lot with the fair, came and was part of it. Had a tour of the fair. Jake Butcher, who was one of the planners of the fair, was a Democrat, and that some people thought might have presidential possibilities. He ran for governor and didn't win, but he was a Democrat in charge of this fair. But then when the fair opened, Ronald Reagan was president, and he came down here on opening day and gave the big grand fair opening speech. And this event actually is mentioned in some the official Reagan biographies. But here's a picture with Jake Butcher, the Democratic politician, of course, who a few months later was under arrest and for bank fraud and spent a good many years in prison for that. But Reagan and Nancy Reagan and Bo Roberts, who was kind of the manager of the World's Fair, very important guy. and that's Howard Baker on the right. I can't, on my screen, I can't see the right, that part of it, but Howard Baker, who would run for president himself. We'll talk about him and more in just a minute. We're kind of running through these pretty quickly. This is kind of an overview of a lot of really interesting stuff. But over the years, both the Bushes, George W. and George H.W. were here for, especially for fundraisers. That I think a lot of Republicans have found this this fertile ground for fundraisers, especially in the late 20th century, early 21st century. But there's one I began to wonder about 5 years ago whether Barack Obama would be the first president since the Civil War to serve two terms in office. Here we go. Here's a late addition to the slideshow. These pictures were taken by our friend Paul James in 2000 out at McGee Tyson Airport when Al Gore was here and making a last-ditch effort to get his home state to vote for him. Unfortunately, his home state didn't vote for him. It was the beginning of Tennessee being an all Republican all the time state, which it never was before 2000. And I'm not, why that changed suddenly in 2000 would be a subject for another discussion, and that I would like to be part of, but that's not where we're not going to figure that out tonight. But Gore was here and when he was running for president, and Paul found this picture. Do you have any other pictures of that? Or is that the only one you got?
This is the one I put on tonight. None of them really came out very well, but that's probably the best.
Yeah.
You were there too, Jack, right?
Yeah. I didn't get nearly that close, but
I was quite surprised digging these out. That I must have got fairly close, but terrible camera. Oh well.
Yeah. But about 5 years ago, I was beginning to wonder whether Barack Obama would be the first president to serve two terms in office without ever coming to Knoxville. But toward the end of his second term, he did come here and gave a talk out at Mississippi State in 2015, and this was a great example of kind of reaching across the aisle, so to speak, because he came here because he was inspired by something a Republican governor had done in Tennessee. Bill Haslam had started this idea called Tennessee Promise, and it was this idea of everybody is guaranteed a couple of years at a community college. And Obama wanted to make this a national program. This program modeled on Bill Haslam's program in Tennessee, make it a national program. And he came here and he was here publicly with Bill Haslam, the Republican governor, and with a guy named Joe Biden, who was here that night. So Joe Biden and his wife, who was also involved with this, we're all here together for this big event that toward the end of Obama's presidency. But I mentioned that, since the Civil War, no U.S. president has served two terms in office without having visited Knoxville. So that's something to think about. In fact, if you don't count Lincoln, who was shot early in his second term, no president since James Monroe, I think, has served two terms without visiting Knoxville. So at this point, most of the presidents have been here over the years. But next, we're going to be talking about candidates from Knoxville. This is a much shorter list, and I'm talking about only major party candidates, people who really had a shot at something. We're doing this kind of backwards this time, since we did the others chronologically forwards, and also because I had a little hint of a quiz that will answer a little bit. The question is, who's the only presidential candidate to be publicly supported by both Davy Crockett and Abraham Lincoln, and he's buried in downtown Knoxville. We'll be talking about him at the end of this series. But anyway, this is Lamar Alexander, who was born is from Maryville, really, but he was born in Knoxville. I learned that I never knew that until I mentioned in a column several years ago that Bill Haslam was the first Knoxville governor since Parson Brownlow and I quickly, within hours of going to print, heard from Alexander's press office. So they said, "Don't you know that Lamar Alexander was born in Knoxville? He was born at Fort Sanders Hospital." I said, "Excuse me, I'll remember that." But anyway, he Maryville claims him, but he was born here in Knoxville, and of course to his left is Howard Baker, and you can see Howard Baker's first wife who died a few years later is under the umbrella behind him. But Lamar Alexander was briefly a candidate in 1996, withdrew before the major major primaries. I'm sorry he did. I think it would have been an interesting candidate. But of course, Lamar Alexander Parkway in Maryville is named for him. But next, we'll be talking about Howard Baker just for a moment. Howard Baker, very popular senator from Tennessee, was not from Knoxville. He was from up in Huntsville, Tennessee. But he lived here for a few years when he was getting his law degree at UT. So he was, we claim him as a Knoxvillian. He was also a partner in a law firm here, and later on, of course, had an office when they opened the Baker Center at UT. But he was a more substantial candidate in 1980, and I think he finally gave up when he realized the Reagan Revolution was going on. I think he would have been a great president, a great candidate, great president as well. But ended up working for President Reagan as his chief of staff late in his administration. But a very prominent senator, was a majority leader, a minority leader, and was a major figure in the Watergate investigation. But much admired guy around town. Of course, not only the Baker Center at UT that I just mentioned, which is an interesting place to have public events, but also the Baker Federal Building downtown is named for him. Next, going back again, we're going back in time a little bit more. Estes Kefauver is a UT grad. He lived here. He's from southeastern Tennessee, but lived here when he went to UT. Played on the football team in 1924. Actually graduated in 1924. Had played on the football team. It might have been easier. This is before Neyland. It might have been easier to get on the football team than it would have been 5 or 10 years later. But he was at least a Tennessee Vol at that time. Played tackle and guard. He lived at the Kappa Sigma house in Maplehurst, an old house that had been the Sanford I want to say mansion. It was a big house in Maplehurst, middle Maplehurst there. So he lived here for several years. At one time was planning to live in Knoxville, was planning to have a law practice here, and it didn't work out. He was trying to make some connections after he got his law degree, and just didn't work out. But he later became a U.S. senator. Of course, was a very popular guy. Generally, a progressive senator. Was not a segregationist. I think he's one of the very few Southern senators who are not hardcore segregationists. He refused to sign a segregationist pact. He was best known, though, for his fighting organized crime, the Kefauver Committee, which was kind of stared down the mafia to some extent. I've heard, I haven't seen it yet, but in Las Vegas, there's a museum of organized crime, and they have a whole room devoted to Estes Kefauver and his investigations there. They came here to do some research on it some years ago. But he ran for well-known guy, known for, we don't have a picture of him with his coonskin cap, but that became his kind of symbol, his mascot in a way. But he was known for helping break the Crump machine, which had controlled the Democratic Party out of Memphis for many years. And he didn't cooperate with the Crump machine. So he had a lot of, he was an interesting guy, a bold, a brave guy, and was willing to face both the mafia and the Crump machine, which was something not someone with a weak spine could do. But he ran for president in 1952 and 56, significant campaigns for president, and was so popular that he was chosen to be the running mate of Adlai Stevenson in 1956. Of course, it didn't work out. It was rather running against a very popular president, Dwight Eisenhower, and lost. But an interesting and generally a worthwhile guy. Died very suddenly in office, almost literally in office. I think he'd just been in the Senate when he collapsed in 1963 at the age of 60, and died of a heart attack. His office was preserved and reconstructed in the Hoskins Library at UT, and was there for many years. As just something you go look at and see what Kefauver's office looked like on the last day of his life. There were like birthday cards and all sorts of things. They put things together exactly as they had found it, and in his office, and it was there as a museum piece. Little known to a lot of people. I was trying to tell people about it, but until it finally started falling off the building, with the Kefauver wing, they found it had serious structural issues, and they tore it off the building, and fortunately saved all the stuff in it. I think it's in boxes somewhere now. It had been in the Baker Center at one time. I'm not sure if it's still there or not. But our second to last one is another Democrat a few years earlier, William Gibbs McAdoo. He was son of a UT professor, a guy who'd been a UT professor before the Civil War. Grew up partly in Georgia as a kid, but moved here as a teenager, lived downtown, moved back to Knoxville where his father lived before. They lived downtown. He went to UT. He began his law career here, working as a clerk in the federal building downtown. But later on came back to as a businessman with this idea to introduce streetcars, electric streetcars to Knoxville. He was the guy that brought us electric streetcars for the first time in 1890, before most cities in America had electric streetcars. We did, thanks to William Gibbs McAdoo. The very first one was from downtown to Jailhouse Park. But he was later went to New York with a little bit of experience with public transportation, and built the first subway tunnel under the Hudson River. He was known as, he was president of the company that did it. At least he was the guy that made all this work in New York. So he got pretty well known, and got Woodrow Wilson's attention. He hired him to be Secretary of the Treasury in 1913. And after he was already in the White House, he noticed Wilson's daughter and married her, and they were married in 1914. While he was Secretary of the Treasury, they had a new idea called the Federal Reserve Board, and this all started under McAdoo's watch. It was a very unusually influential Secretary of the Treasury, but also the fact that he controlled the railroads during World War I. He did lots of things that were they're kind of out of the box for a Secretary of the Treasury typically. But after he was after Wilson's administration was over, he went out to California, was elected senator, but also while he was there, believe it or not, and this sounds like I'm starting to make this up, he helped co-found, he made friends with Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford and a couple other people, and co-founded United Artists. So if you hear about United Artists, the movie studio, William Gibbs McAdoo from Knoxville is one of the, he was the lawyer, the guy who was drawing up the documents and making things work. He ran for president twice in 1920 and 1924, eventually yielded to other Democrats who were actually nominated for the office. In 1932, he helped nominate Franklin Roosevelt, who he became a great admirer of. In fact, he died in 1941 on his way to Roosevelt's third inauguration. But my question was, last time I mentioned, I had a question, and I mentioned earlier tonight, who was the only candidate in American history ever to be supported by two legends of American history, Davy Crockett and Abraham Lincoln. And here's a picture of him. They called him the Skeleton. He was a U.S. senator in the 1920s and 30s. Ran for president, and I said 1820s and 30s. He ran for president in 1834 to 1836. It was kind of a long campaign. In fact, Davy Crockett was on the committee that drafted him, more or less. It was in the days when gentlemen didn't run for the presidency, and he was that kind of guy. He didn't really campaign, but Davy Crockett nominated him, and he stood for the presidency as an anti-Jackson Democrat. That was what they called him. Um, I'll let you think about this guy. He's a hint. He's the son of the guy credited with founding Knoxville, James White. His name is Hugh Lawson White. He was Secretary Pro Tem of the U.S. Senate in 1833 after Calhoun resigned. So he, at one time, by the rules of the day, he was second would have been second, first and first. He would have been the person who would have taken over if President Jackson had died in office in early 1833. Hugh Lawson White of Knoxville would have become president. But he ran for president in 1836, had a good shot at it at first. In 1835, a young Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer in Illinois, was impressed with White, and his first political gesture, Lincoln's first political gesture, was to write something in the newspaper that said, "I'm for Hugh Lawson White of Tennessee for president." There are some people who I understand that after Harrison entered the race, he might have shifted his allegiance to Harrison, his fellow Midwesterner. But as it happened, the field got kind of crowded. It was White, the anti-Jackson Democrat, who in forming an anti-Jackson Democrat party, he helped kind of de facto helped found the new Whig Party, which was the anti-Jackson party that dominated politics in America for over 20 years. But a couple of other Whigs who were kind of allies of his, Daniel Webster and William Henry Harrison, also ran for the office. So they were, even though they were kind of on the same side, they were all running together with the idea that if they got a majority of the votes, of the Electoral College votes, they would have to throw this into Congress and keep Martin Van Buren away from the presidency. Well, it didn't work. Van Buren was just popular enough with Jackson's help. Andrew Jackson wanted Van Buren to be his successor because he knew Van Buren was a very loyal Jackson man who would do what Jackson wanted to do. Jackson was retiring and going back to the Hermitage, but Van Buren was essentially going to be Jackson Jr. in office, and Hugh Lawson White and other people thought that was not a good thing for the Republic, for a president to be able to designate his successor, but they failed to stop it, but that was why that all just ended. That was White actually died during the term that he campaigned for, and died. He came down with the horrible plague of 1838, and may never have fully recovered from it. It was a plague of unknown source, and he died in 1840, a couple of years later. But this was really the beginning of the two-party system in America. It became Democrats versus Whigs, and then Democrats versus Republicans after that. Hugh Lawson White is buried at the First Presbyterian graveyard downtown, and you can see his grave today. And oddly, really oddly, there's a historical plaque there that mentions several historical figures who were buried in the graveyard and does not mention Hugh Lawson White. This is the only guy from his era, a Knoxvillian of his era, who's probably in your high school history book. He's in most history books that I've seen, at least mentioned. This unusual race in 1836 that didn't work out for White and Daniel Webster and William Henry Harrison, although Harrison was elected the following election. But anyway, this is he's the most famous guy in that graveyard, and he's not mentioned in the plaque. Anyway, well, as usual, I've gone slightly over, I think, but I would love to, if anybody has any memories of seeing presidents in Knoxville or had any comments about the presentation or questions, I'll be happy to entertain them now. I'll be Interested to see what happens with this presidential museum idea, whether there's anything to that or not. It's been discussed off and on for 20 years. I thought it had been forgotten, but I've just in the last few months been hearing people talk about it again.
I mentioned in the comments that I heard Johnson when he was in Knoxville. And one of the key things that was that, in addition to his talking about poverty, et cetera, is that he's much taller than I had anticipated from all the pictures. I think he was 6'4". And secondly, I was disappointed that he didn't mention Kefauver at all. And then I remembered that Journey was not very friendly to Kefauver or to Gore. But
that's interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah. Kefauver had died the year before he came to Knoxville. In 64. And
then I'd heard Kennedy just about 9 months prior to that in Nashville. Okay. And one thing that Kennedy did in Nashville was to push a button to start the building of a dam. And I thought it was unfortunate that he could not quote Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt, about the public be damned when he pushed the button, but there was no way I could get to his speechwriters.
Well, I'm glad you tried. Yeah. Well, thanks. That's a great comment.
I may have missed it, but I didn't hear what presidents. You said they might make a presidential library of. What president was it?
Well, not a presidential library, but a presidential museum of all the presidents. That's
all the presidents. Oh.
And I'm not promoting it or anything. We're not involved with that. I'd be happy to help if they want our help, but I haven't. I don't know the people intimately.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but I think if not Knoxville, I mean Cleveland Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Why, if Cleveland can have the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, why can't we have a presidential museum? I don't know why, but we're as presidential as most cities are.
I have a napkin that Rose Kennedy blotted her lipstick on from a tea that my mother and grandmother hosted for her at the Andrew Johnson Hotel when she was campaigning for her son.
No kidding.
I don't know, maybe we can DNA it like on the
Rose Kennedy.
Sheldon thing.
I never knew that she was here. I'll have to look that up.
I'll send you a copy of the letter he sent my mother that thanked her for hosting his mother for this tea. Wow. I'll send a copy of it for y'all.
Thanks a lot. That's great. Thanks.
Who was just speaking, by the way?
It's Jackie in Nashville.
Oh, hey, Jackie. How are you? Just couldn't tell.
Sorry, it's the cat.
That's okay. There's a cat there. Thank you.
Yeah, it's amazing the people who stayed at the Andrew Johnson. King Hussein of Jordan was there once. Duke Ellington, Amelia Earhart, Jean-Paul Sartre, of course, Hank Williams. It's just a fascinating collection of people who've been there, and the idea that it might be a hotel again has been intriguing to lots of mayors over the years. I like to think it might happen.
Jack, I interviewed Nancy Reagan at East Tennessee Children's Hospital.
Really?
When she was here, but I believe that was, I don't believe Ronald Reagan was with her.
How about that? When was that?
Probably, well, it was while he was president. I don't remember exactly. I would have to look up the story.
1980s, yeah.
She presided over some sort of a party for some of the children, and I had a brief interview with her, but I don't remember her being able to get her to say anything that was of much interest.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure Reagan was president when she came, Marty. You're right about that.
Yes, yeah, it would have been during his presidency.
Right.
And I also traveled with Al Gore during his first attempt to get the Democratic nomination for the presidency while he was in North Carolina. and was in the van with him. And I was mainly just impressed by the amount of the intense effort between stops for him to study the influential people he was going to meet at the next stop, and commit some facts about them to memory so that he could be friendly with them. They just had notebooks, these gray note binders that were just crammed with information about the people he was going to meet between every stop. And what he did most of the time was just study those binders, the information in those binders really hard, and and then give the same speech, the same 10 or 15-minute speech at every whistle stop. So
Yeah, well, thanks for telling us. I appreciate that story.
Estes Kefauver, as the vice presidential nominee with Stevenson, played that role for basically letting Stevenson know who are these people that we're meeting with, and this type of history, where Stevenson was somewhat removed from them.
Yeah. I wish I had something like that.
Yeah.
They said that Estes Kefauver had almost a photographic memory. My uncle knew Estes Kefauver well, and he said that if Estes met you in 10 years later, he would remember your name.
That's something that Franklin Roosevelt had, that people are amazed. My grandfather met him once at Wilson Dam, the TVA Dam, and Roosevelt, they said, and this is how things were in the 1930s. They said, our bodyguard is sick. He said, Mr. Neely, can you handle a gun? And he said, I think so, yeah. And they handed him I think a 38 pistol. So just put this in your pocket. If anything happens, take care of it. And my grandfather, he was a big guy, and I think they picked him for that reason. He was an engineer at TVA, but they introduced him to the president, and my grandfather was so nervous he had his hand in his pocket on the gun, and he pulled the gun out when he reached to shake Roosevelt's hand, and everybody was kind of alarmed for a moment, and it was and Roosevelt was kind of surprised himself, but he met him 3 years later, just a brief moment there, and Franklin Roosevelt looked at him at another TVA dam, I think, and said, Mr. Neely, where's your gun? But he remembered him from 3 years earlier, just from that brief snafu.
If you'll return at some point to that photo of Richard Nixon speaking to the Pride of the Southland Band, I believe the man standing behind him looking directly into the camera is probably Billy Graham. Right there. I think that's Billy Graham, but I may be wrong.
There's another picture of Desi Arnaz doing the same thing with the UT band. I think he's helping. He was here in 1940, and they introduced him to the UT band, and I think he acted like he was conducting them.
Yeah, this is Billy Graham, isn't it? Here.
Yeah. And Charlie Reynolds, who was a professor of religion, I interviewed Charlie about. He was one of the people arrested during the demonstrations.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And this is Andy Holt here.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah, it sure is.
President of UT. Yeah, at the time. All right. Anybody else?
I would just say there was one of the Democratic National Conventions where I think Frank Clement, who was governor of Tennessee, was the keynote speaker. And I think that Al Gore Sr. and Kefauver all were nominated to be president at one point. It didn't go very far for Al Gore Sr.
Yeah.
Hey, Jack, didn't you have a little, you saw Reagan on Gay Street, didn't you, one time?
I did, yeah, when he was running. Yeah, in fact, I meant to mention that he came here in 1980 when he was running for president, and his purpose, he had a singular purpose, and that was to assure Knoxville that he did not want to dismantle TVA. That had been one of his talking points back in the 1960s, that he thought TVA was a socialist plot and that it should just be taken apart. And he admitted that in 1980 that he changed his mind about TVA. He loved TVA. He wanted to keep TVA. So he gave a talk right in front of TVA at Market Square. But he was on his way to give that talk, and I was on Gay Street eating a sandwich, and I'd read in the paper that he was trying to appeal more to the youth. He was worried that his supporters were mostly older folks, and I was 21 years old or so, and I was working at the News Sentinel at the time, and just taking a lunch break, and I didn't have time to go to the Market Square, but I had a big hoagie, and he came by, and I remember I picked up my hoagie, and this I was pounced upon. I did not touched, but this guy came up right to me, this Secret Service guy, and had a good look at that hoagie I had in my hand. But Reagan came by, and there weren't that all of the fans were waiting for him on Market Square, so it was kind of sparse on Gay Street. There weren't that many people on the street, and he saw me and saw I was a young guy with a sandwich, and he just waved at me and wouldn't stop waving until I waved back. He just wanted to make a connection with a young person in Knoxville, at least one of them. But yeah, that was my one connection with Ronald Reagan. All right, any other questions or comments or memories or?
Just make one more comment that as probably about a fifth grader, I was visiting my grandmother in Washington, D.C., and it's Howard Baker Sr. Who greeted me when I went to the Capitol and gave me the ticket to sit in the gallery.
Yeah.
And that was right after the Puerto Rican group had shot out the top of the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
And Richard Nixon was vice president. So I saw Nixon when he was vice president.
Howard Sr. was congressman at that time, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Jack, another interesting program might be on the vice presidents that have come through here.
You're right. You're right.
So, in addition to this group, when you've got a little bit more time, just a suggestion.
Now that you mentioned that, I should say that whoever's president next year, they were both here in 2015 for very different reasons.
Okay.
Joe Biden was here with Obama talking about education, and Trump was here for a big rally that I think you covered, Georgetta, if I'm not mistaken, that giant Trump rally at the convention center.
Well, I did a column on it.
Did a column, yeah.
And,
You don't have to actually go.
And
to
all
it,
the people around, we won't.
There was one where they misspelled the banner, and I looked that up today, and the person in charge of the arrangements was Hope Hicks, whose name we've heard a lot lately because she got COVID, but the banner misspelled the word Tennessee. It said Tennessee welcomes Donald Trump, and they left out one S.
I'm told that John Nance Garner, FDR's first vice president, is like my second cousin or third cousin. And had strong ties to East Tennessee, and also Middle Tennessee. But he's supposed to be like my grandmother's second cousin.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
I'm a little embarrassed to admit it, but I did go to the airport and saw Barry Goldwater when I was in high school.
Well, he's looking smarter all the time. But yeah, in 1964, I guess. I saw.
Hey Jack, I know George Bush was here, wasn't he? Because I don't know what year it was, but I saw his motorcade on Alcoa Highway.
He was here several times. Whenever he needs more money, he would come to Knoxville and have another fundraiser, and $1,000 plate fundraiser.
Absolutely, has himself there.
Yeah.
Related to Goldwater, you may remember the advertisement that Johnson ran against Goldwater related to the atomic bomb and the explosion. And a key person in that advertising was Eugene Case, who was a graduate of Central High from Knoxville. And his dad was, I think, personnel manager of TVA at one point. Or
did not know that at all.
That was a Knoxville.
Walter, was that the one where they were plucking the petals off the daisy and then the atomic bomb blows up? Okay, yeah,
So a Knoxville person was instrumental in that.
For better or
Okay.
worse, but that case, C-A-S-E,
CASE, Gene Case, he died about 10 years ago, I think.
okay,
He
yeah.
was a New York advertising person, and in his later years was spending the time with nonprofits and I think the Democrats.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, thanks. Anybody else? This is really interesting stuff y'all are sharing with us tonight.
We appreciate everybody. I was beginning to wonder if everyone being a bit burnt out with the presidential race this weekend, but this has been an interesting talk, Jack.
Well, thanks a lot. Yeah, I appreciate everybody joining us. All right, well, join us next week, and I appreciate you all joining us tonight, and God bless America.